I'm overwhelmed by my desire to introduce our next speaker. Dan Arnold is Associate Professor of the Philosophy of Religions and Associate Faculty in South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Is this thing on? Can you hear me? I guess it... He's a scholar of Indian Buddhist philosophy, which he engages in a philosophically constructive and comparative way. His first book, Buddhists, Brahmins, and Belief, Epistemology in South Asian Philosophy of Religion, came out in 2005. It won an American Academy of Religion Award for excellence in the study of religion. His second book, Brains, Buddhas, and Believing, The Problem of Intentionality in Classical Buddhist and Cognitive Scientific Philosophy of Mind, came out more recently in 2012. And it centers on the contemporary philosophical category of intentionality taken as useful in thinking through central issues in classical Buddhism. The book received and I may not pronounce this correctly, but I think it's the Toshihide? Okay, I did it right. Toshihide Numata Book Prize in Buddhism, awarded by the Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And he's presently working on an anthology of Madhyamaka texts in translation to appear in the series Historical Source Books in Classical Indian Thought. Please welcome Professor Dan Arnold.
Thanks for the introduction, which makes me think I need to shorten the blurb on my webpage. And thanks for the invitation to be here. I've never been to this part of California, and it's really true. It is the promised land. I'm glad to be here. At a conference on the self, someone who works on Buddhist thought has a peculiar contribution to make, because the cardinal doctrine of Indian Buddhist thought, an aside to say that when I talk about Buddhism today, I'm just talking about especially first millennium Indian Buddhist philosophy. But the cardinal doctrine of Indian Buddhist thought, the claim that every other philosophical position in the tradition is about, or is elaborating, is the doctrine of anÄtmavÄda, or no self. So the first thing a Buddhist scholar is apt to say at a conference about the self is that there just isn't one. A lot of ink has been spilled by scholars, both traditional and modern, in trying to make sense of this claim. Instead of rehearsing for you the various ways this doctrine has been understood, I'll say for now only that in order to get clear on what Indian Buddhists mean in saying that we are not selves, or that we do not have selves, we have to be clear on the soteriological problem that Buddhists, along with a great many of their contemporaries among other Indian religious and philosophical traditions, were addressing. Most basically, early Indian Buddhists shared with many other Indian thinkers on the scene the view that existence in time is intrinsically problematic. To be a finite temporal being is inevitably to experience loss, and ultimately lasting satisfaction inevitably eludes us. They also shared, with many other Indian thinkers, the idea that what we therefore ought to want is to be released from the conditions of existence in time. What we should strive for is liberation from the ceaseless treadmill of temporal existence, or samsara. It's important to say in this regard, samsara is the idea of cyclic existence, rebirth, and it's important to appreciate in this regard that that we are reborn for Buddhists and most other Indian thinkers is a problem. We're apt to encounter that doctrine and say, oh, fortunately I get another chance, maybe I'll get into a better school next time, maybe I'll be an astronaut next time. But to them, it's the problem to be overcome. So release from that cycle is what we're striving for. So Many early Indian thinkers were moved to search for some part of human being that is already essentially free of temporal conditions, something that stays the same through all change, something that is not subject to repeated death and rebirth. Indian traditions, thinkers in the traditions that would give rise to what we nowadays call Hinduism, thus tried to identify and characterize what they referred to as the Atman, a self that is the independent and autonomous agent of our actions and the enjoyer of all our experiences, the thing which has all of the properties and states that occur in the course of a lifetime, something that somehow counts as what we really are. And the idea they seem to have had is that in identifying and characterizing an Atman, they are identifying something in us that's not impacted by all the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And their thought is that if we could only come to see that that is what we really are, this unchanging Atman, we would be free of the distress that necessarily characterizes existence in time. Okay? This is the kind of view against which the Buddhists developed their insight. So against this self doctrine, Buddhists were inclined to argue that not only is there no really enduring thing that we really are, but also that our attachment to the idea that there must be such a thing is precisely the source of our suffering. So on the Buddhist analysis, it's insofar as we're deeply resistant to the ongoing loss that necessarily characterizes existence in time, that we structure our lives around the achievement of the kind of independence and security that might ultimately be enjoyed by the selves that we really are. But their thought is that insofar as we are thus striving for something fundamentally incoherent, we are really just further involving ourselves in precisely the delusions that make temporal existence so hard to bear in the first place. So what Buddhists would have us recognize is that there is no such thing as what we really are. The whole Buddhist project is about disabusing us of the idea that, an idea that I think we all innately have, that I am a real and lasting thing whose ultimate satisfaction can be achieved. So, from the get-go, this is the founding insight of the tradition, Buddhists are in the business of arguing against the intelligibility of the idea that there could be, over and above the manifestly temporal and fleeting parts of our lives and experience, an unchanging whole to which those parts belong, or which those parts constitute. In contemporary philosophical terms, then, the basic Buddhist impulse is to elaborate reductionist accounts of persons. So they would say the reason it makes sense to say there are no selves is that any and every moment of experience will turn out to be reducible to a host of impersonal factors, no one of which is what we really are. So the flip side of the doctrine of selflessness is the doctrine of dependent origination. It's because each moment of experience originates out of a host of causes and conditions that no particular moment could ever count as me, as what I really am. To that extent, to the extent that theirs is a basically reductionist sort of approach, Buddhist philosophers have real affinities with the projects of many modern philosophers. David Hume and Derek Parfit are perhaps the most recurrently mentioned in this regard. But it's also not for nothing that Buddhists so often figure, as they do these days, in recently faddish cognitive scientific studies of religion. So who among us has not seen a photo of a Tibetan meditator wired for fMRI scans, or heard the Dalai Lama characterized as a mind scientist, or whatever? Buddhist philosophers, much like David Hume and his contemporary successors, urge us to recognize that if we introspectively search for ourselves, all that will ever show up is particular fleeting sensations, only this feeling and that one, and never anything that would make sense as the self to whom these momentary events belongs. For Buddhists, only change is real, not continuity. Only parts are real, not the wholes that they supposedly compose. This has led more than a few contemporary philosophers to think of Buddhists as fellow travelers. So a lot of contemporary philosophers think Buddhists, like us, are concerned to give a naturalistic, reductionist account of what being a person consists in. And Buddhists like us rightly saw that, as we do, that there are no essences to things. So there's something contemporary sounding about some of this. It's important to note one really significant problem with the often too quick assumption that Buddhist reductionisim is thoroughly compatible with contemporary scientific thought. And this is that while many, if not most, contemporary reductionists are physicalists, they typically hold that all that's finally real is the kinds of things that figure in physical scientific explanations, and everything there is to being a person or being minded must therefore be reducible to those kinds of things. Buddhist philosophers emphatically rejected physicalism. They were generally dualists, and if anything, the real conceptual pressure in the tradition was towards idealism. So it's important to appreciate that it's possible to be a reductionist without being a physicalist. This is a counterintuitive thought to many people nowadays, particularly insofar as contemporary reductionism is often sort of lazily characterized as anti-Cartesian. We're generally encouraged to suppose that to reduce experience to various causes and conditions just is to argue against dualism, where that's taken to be the view that there is some sole substance over and above these conditions. But while Buddhists would certainly agree in thinking it problematic to suppose with Descartes that there is any mental substance over and above the fleeting neurophysical events of embodied experience, they'll say that mind is not a substance, it's just a causal continuum of events. They also held that there are fundamentally different kinds of events to which anything can be reduced. So there's no contradiction in holding both that experience is endlessly analyzable into all manner of impersonal events, and that mental events can never be reduced to physical ones. This, in fact, is why it makes sense for Buddhists to have upheld belief in what we typically refer to as rebirth, although that's a rather misleading term. The prefix re suggests there's some one thing repeatedly undergoing the same experience. Their thought is that one is not released from the conditions of existence in time simply by dying, because the psychological continuum of mental events continues without interruption after the death of the body. It's independent. So, we should, for this and a number of other reasons, be wary of too quickly assenting to the idea that Buddhist thought is uniquely among the world's religions compatible with contemporary scientific thought. And I would refer you in this regard to a nifty little book by Donald Lopez called The Scientific Buddha. I think that's called The Scientific Buddha, His Short Unhappy Life. Which is a really eminently readable and short attempt to disabuse us of this meme, this sort of Buddhism and science meme. But be that as it may, I want to suggest that there is, in fact, an important respect in which mainstream Buddhist philosophy is similar to the kind of philosophy of mind that's informed by contemporary science. So let me say a bit then about Abhidharma. Okay? Abhidharma names one of the main genres of canonical Buddhist literature, and it's the one with which something worth the name Buddhist philosophy really begins. Abhidharma literature is often characterized as the earliest metaphysics in Buddhist literature. And the task of the Abhidharma literature was the basically exegetical task of making sense of how all of the teachings traditionally attributed to the Buddha fit together. So in the voluminous corpus of teachings attributed to the Buddha, one finds countless different ways of talking about the basic idea of selflessness. So we're taught that that there's no self because each moment of experience is reducible to some combination of the 5 aggregates, or some combination of the 12 sense spheres, or some combination of the 18 sensory domains, and on and on and on. To the dismay of many a budding Buddhologist, there's just endless profusion of lists of categories in the tradition. And it can be hard to make sense of how or whether all these different lists fit together. Moreover, these many and various lists show up in teachings and stories that inevitably make reference to things like persons and selves. For it turns out it's well nigh impossible to talk about the career and teachings of the Buddha without making reference to the person who was the Buddha, or the persons who were his illustrious students, or the persons, we who are reading the texts, who are enjoined to undertake this or that religious practice. So how are we to make sense of this profusion of teachings that at once presupposes a lot of the ordinary language of persons and selves, and at the same time proposes reductionist analyses of such things in terms of a huge range of different categories, impersonal categories? Faced with this task, the texts of the Abhidharma literature set about elaborating the idea that there are really two kinds of truth. And this is a crucial part of the basic grammar of Buddhist discourses, this idea of two truths. It's the idea that we always have to distinguish between what Buddhist thinkers referred to as conventional truth and ultimate truth. This distinction makes it possible to understand the inevitability of referring in lots of different contexts to things like persons and selves, to all the things that figure in our ordinary experience, temporally enduring macro objects, what J.L. Austin called medium-sized dry goods. All of these kinds of things are conventionally real. So it is, in other words, useful for certain purposes and in certain contexts to suppose these things are real, and the achievement of various human aims and tasks is facilitated by our agreeing to refer to such things, even though they aren't ultimately real. These kinds of things, conventionally real things, and paradigmatically that means selves or persons, do not, however, count as ultimately real. So none of these belongs, as philosophers would say, in a final ontology, in a complete list of the most explanatorily basic and real kinds of things. So what the Abhidharma literature attempts to do is to sort through all the different kinds of things referred to in the Buddhist teachings and provide a systematic account of what the ultimately real categories are, and an account of how everything that figures in ordinary experience, everything that's just conventionally real, can be explained by or reduced to the ultimately real things. So this is the sense in which traditional Buddhist philosophy does have something similar to the kind of contemporary philosophy of mind that's informed by scientific research. So we can think of the Abhidharma literature as elaborating something like a complete scientific redescription of reality. So all the kinds of things that count as ultimately real are the kinds of things that figure in a finally true account of what really exists. And everything that's conventionally real has to be explicable in terms of those. And as with a lot of contemporary scientific accounts of things, the ultimately true account looks really different than the account of ordinary experience. So this is a complete redescription of experience in exhaustively impersonal terms. So thinkers in this stream of Buddhist philosophy took it that all the features of ordinary experience, our sense of ourselves as relatively continuous beings who go through life encountering various kinds of things and having various kinds of experiences, these are what require explanation. And their philosophical wager was that all of these things could be explained as ultimately consisting simply in causally continuous series of momentary impersonal events. So, much like some contemporary philosophers of mind, they held that an ultimately true account of what is real would make no reference to the kinds of things we typically think are real, regardless of our deeply held sense that we are relatively enduring beings who have beliefs and act for reasons and so forth. An ultimately true description of reality would not include reference to any of these kinds of things. Okay. So much for a brief sketch of Abhidharma. Let's try briefly to understand the sense it can make to think of this philosophical project as religiously transformative. And here I want to introduce a Sanskrit word that figures centrally in the Buddhist tradition, the word Bhavana. which is the word perhaps most often translated as meditation. So in reading Indian Buddhist texts, if you come across the word meditation, chances are good it's rendering the word Bhavana. And we are typically encouraged to suppose that meditation is the most basic Buddhist practice, that it's what Buddhists do. In fact, though, it has historically been the case that most Buddhists do not meditate. It was only specialized religious elite practitioners who would engage in this sort of thing. But be that as it may, the point I would emphasize is that it's a little misleading to translate the word bhavana as meditation. The word comes from a causative stem of one of the verbal roots meaning to be. So bhavana literally denotes an act of causing to be, an act of making real, an act of actualizing. So any act of making something real or actual is bhavana. And to engage in bhavana is to engage in any practice of actualizing Buddhist teachings, of making them vividly real instead of just things we assent to. And this idea figures perhaps most recurrently in a traditionally Buddhist idea of three progressively more subtle grades of wisdom or gnosis, prajna. The three are the wisdom that comes from hearing, the wisdom that comes from reflection, and the wisdom, finally, that comes from bhavana. And the idea here is that before one can make any progress on the Buddhist path, it stands to reason that, of course, one must first hear the teachings. One has to encounter the claims of the tradition and be presented with its claims and insights. Further, the second step, one must reflect on these. In order to be changed by the tradition, you have to understand the teachings. You have to engage in interpretation. You have to do philosophy so you can really understand what the claims mean. But emphasizing that the right kind of relation to the tradition consists in something very much more than just understanding and assenting to certain basic claims, the tradition stresses that having understood the teachings, one must then make them real. And this, in bhavana, the act of making these real, that's where the rubber hits the road. This is the really important part. So you have to make these teachings, the claims and insights of the tradition, real in such a way that you're not just capable of rehearsing Buddhist arguments and understanding their claims, but actually being transformed by them, such that you experience the world in the terms of these categories and this analysis. So to be liberated from habitual self-grasping, it's not enough just to accept the conclusions of the arguments for selflessness and say, oh yeah, I believe there's no self, I can show you the arguments. You have to be changed by it, and that requires internalizing this description. So, meditative practices are, for sure, among the tradition's tools for doing this. One of the suggestions I'm making, though, is that it's wrong to suppose that meditation is what Buddhists really do, and that, for example, Buddhist philosophy is something simply auxiliary to that. In fact, when traditionally trained Buddhist scholars of the first millennium, and traditionally trained Tibetan Buddhist scholars to this day, were engaging in Abhidharma literature, so when, in other words, they were spending day after day memorizing prodigious amounts of these texts and producing and hearing commentary on them, they were engaged in bhavana. So to relate to the texts of the tradition in the way these guys did, by memorizing the texts, internalizing them, structuring their lives around the realization of them, to do that just is to work at teaching yourself to experience the world in terms of the impersonal categories of these texts. So by elaborating and engaging this traditional attempt to develop an ultimately true description of what really exists, thinkers in this tradition, who, probably like most pre-modern religious thinkers, related to the texts of the tradition in fundamentally different ways than we're encouraged to appreciate. There's a good book on this by Paul Griffiths called Religious Reading. Buddhist thinkers were systematically redescribing their own experience and working to constitute themselves as moral agents who lived out of the tradition's worldview. So perhaps counterintuitively, we can think of the Abhidharma literature, philosophical corpus that's all about systematically denying the reality of self as an integral part of a religious project of self-transformation. So the practice of internalizing the Abhidharma tradition's impersonal description of reality thus counts, and I'm not the first to suggest this, as a paradigm case of what Michel Foucault called technologies of the self. To work this way at systematically denying the reality of the self just is to work at constituting oneself as the kind of subject, the kind of self, for whom selflessness is immediately experienced as real. And we can imagine the various ways in which this might be a beneficial sort of thing. I found myself thinking in this regard of Kwong Loy Shun's talk earlier today, which similarly represented practices for achieving an impersonal perspective on things like anger and emotion. This you can imagine this, that constituting yourself this way would have a similar effect. You teach yourself to distance yourself from emotional reactions and the like. All right. Now, the foregoing picture raises lots of interesting questions. Chief among these, I suggest, is the question of whether the Buddhist scholastics who engaged in this project of self-transformation are best understood as realizing the truth of selflessness or as producing it. In other words, does the project of internalizing a radically revisionary account of one's own experience facilitate the discovery that there really is ultimately no self? Or does it constitute someone as a person who takes that to be true, perhaps independently of whether it really is? There is, I think, good reason to think these alternatives needn't be mutually exclusive. So one could say, for example, that in order to discover what is really true, one must first have cultivated an appropriate sensitivity to truth. There's a Christian theological analog of this idea, the idea that the difference between those who are and those who are not moved by arguments for the existence of God is that some have appropriately developed sensus divinitatis and some don't. Be that as it may, what I want to develop, and this is the point that the talk's been building up to, a different way of thinking about the kind of question I've said is raised by this picture of Buddhist philosophers as making real the claims of the tradition. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to the fact that some Buddhist philosophers took issue with the Abhidharma project and strongly refused the idea that there is any ultimate truth of the matter when it comes to what there really exists. So the Abhidharma sort of approach that I sketched for you, I think, arguably is the mainstream philosophical approach and gives rise in later history to Yogacara, another of the mainstream Buddhist philosophical schools. But there is an important and influential philosophical school that really strongly dissents from this and thinks the whole Abhidharma direction of taking the tradition is mistaken. And I have in mind thinkers who styled themselves Madhyamakas, proponents of the middle way. And these are thinkers who take their bearings from the great and much discussed Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna. As I understand him, and my interpretation's not uncontroversial, it happens to be right, but as I understand him, Nagarjuna was concerned to argue that Buddhist proponents of the Abhidharma project ended up making the same mistake that Indian proponents of the self idea made. If, as many classical Indian thinkers supposed, the most significant religious question is what really exists, early Hindu thinkers answered that the Atman alone is really real. Elaborating the Buddhist doctrine of selflessness, Abhidharma thinkers instead took it upon themselves to explain that what really exists, if there are no selves, is causally continuous series of momentary events. They answered the question. What really exists? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's not selves, it's momentary series of causally continuous events. Against this, Nagarjuna, as I take it, his thought was that the real problem at issue was precisely that of supposing that there is an answer to this question, that asking this question, what is there really, is the problem. So, what does my note say? So, to the Abhidharma Buddhists who think their success in here I'm recurring to the question I put a little bit ago about whether this account of Bhavana amounts to saying that these thinkers produce the truth of selflessness rather than discovering something that's true independent of the practice. To the Abhidharma Buddhists who think that they have succeeded, in fact, in discovering ultimate truth, Nagarjuna would argue that they are significantly mistaken. Not because there is no truth to discover, but because it's wrong to think that what's discovered is some really or ultimately existent kinds of things. So the problem is that notwithstanding their radically revisionary sort of answer to the question, what is there really, Abhidharma Buddhists accepted the premise that it's possible to answer the question, that there is something it makes sense to say there really is. Nagarjuna's wager is that whether one affirms that what there really is enduring selves or momentary series of impersonal events, either way, one is attempting to answer a question that cannot be answered. And indeed, our habitual attachment to the thought that there must be an answer to the question, what is there really, that there must be something it makes sense to say there really is precisely the problem to be overcome. So, against the characteristically Abhidharma understanding of the two truths, and recall that this is the idea that all the things of ordinary experience are just conventionally true, while an impersonal account in terms of momentary events shows us what is ultimately true. Against that, Nagarjuna urges, and there's a formula widely attributed to my colleague Mark Sideritz, that the ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth. Now, one way to make sense of that claim is to argue, as Nagarjuna recurrently does, that one could only think one had arrived at the ultimate truth if one supposed that it was possible to say, and here I speak in terms of the Buddhist idea of dependent origination, what it is upon which everything finally depends, that there's something that's at the bottom of the pile of dependent origination. In other words, his thought is that the ultimately existent categories posited by the Abhidharma literature would count as giving us an ultimately true explanation of the phenomenon of dependent origination, only if those categories were themselves an exception to the rule that everything is dependently originated. But if instead those categories turn out upon analysis to be themselves dependently originated, then explanation hasn't come to rest. They in turn require the same kind of explanation, and there's no reason to think we've arrived at a privileged level of description. So Nagarjuna will always argue that anything at all that's proposed as ultimately real will turn out upon analysis to be dependent upon something further. There's no way one could ever be sure one had finally reached the bottom, and anything at all that Buddhists propose as really real, and as more real than the stuff of ordinary experience, will inevitably turn out not to be finally basic, because it will turn out itself to invite just the same kind of analysis. And this is Nagarjuna's MO. All he does in developing his position, and some interpretive debate about whether it's right to say he has a position, but all he does is considers a whole range of explanatory categories involved in Abhidharma Buddhist and in other Indian philosophical schools of thought, and invariably shows that they turn out to be incoherent, that these categories turn out to be unintelligible, they turn out not to be coherent as explanations of what they're supposed to explain. One of the really interesting moves he makes in this regard is to argue that among the things that the explanatorily basic categories proposed by Abhidharma depend on, so remember his thought is, anything you propose as ontologically basic will turn out itself to be dependent on something else. Well, one of the things they will always be dependent on is the very phenomena they were proposed as explaining in the first place. That is, the impersonal categories that Abhidharma Buddhists proposed as ultimately real turn out, among other things, to depend for their intelligibility on the idea of persons. Consider, for example, that any Abhidharma claim at all, such as the claim that there are ultimately no real persons, there are just causally continuous series of momentary events, any such claim only makes sense insofar as it is understood by a person. It's persons for whom claims like this are intelligible. Or consider that the explanations proposed by Abhidharma Buddhists only make sense as explanations of persons. So persons, therefore, cannot be finally eliminated because they have to remain in view as the things we are explaining. If you propose a list of categories and say, well, there's this causally continuous series of momentary events. Well, what individuates it as this continuum rather than that? Oh, well, this is the one that explains Dan. You can't avoid presupposing the person level of description. Or consider again that if we want to make ultimately true claims to the effect that everything else is just conventionally true, and if we allow that, well, things that are conventionally true are, what it means to say they're conventionally true is that they facilitate the achievement of our aims and interests. Well, we've just made reference to somebody's aims and interests as something relative to which conventional truth as a category makes sense. Most importantly for Nagarjuna, the very practice of the Buddhist path, the cultivation of compassion for suffering beings, the realization that one's actions constitute the world one experiences, the aspiration to attain enlightenment, all of this makes sense only as something undertaken by persons. So, against the Abhidharma discourse, Nagarjuna argued that the idea that we can specify that what really exists is fundamentally different from what we typically suppose, he says that can't be the right way to understand the cardinal Buddhist doctrine of selflessness. And it can't be the right way because it explains away the very things necessary to make sense of the practice of Buddhism. So in the seminar yesterday of Scripps Fellows that are involved in this semester-long event, I suggested as reading an essay by Stephen Collins called "What Are Buddhists Doing When They Deny the Reality of the Self?" And he makes a complementary point to mine. He makes the point that the project of Bhavana, of making real the Abhidharma redescription of persons, is itself a practice that only is possible in the social context of monastic life, and that the structure and conception of that world necessarily involves reference to persons. So he makes the point that the ultimately true description proposed in Abhidharma cannot make sense as an account of the social, that there are social conditions of the possibility of cultivating enlightenment, and what we realize upon achieving enlightenment is an account that can't make sense of those social conditions, is the way he identifies the tension. I'm suggesting that Nagarjuna makes a more principled philosophical sort of argument to the effect that the impersonal categories proposed by Abhidharma thinkers are incoherent, and that they cannot give us any explanatory grip on the things they're meant to explain. And they can't because, among other things, they are themselves intelligible only relative to the things that they're supposed to explain. So it's a significant problem that Abhidharma Buddhists, as Nagarjuna understands them, that they mistakenly set about answering the question, what is there really? All right. Now, it might be thought that Nagarjuna understood this way, understood as I've interpreted him, is effectively reneging on the doctrine of selflessness. So if we argue, as I've said that Nagarjuna does, that persons cannot be finally eliminated from a complete Buddhist account, are we not saying, in effect, that there are, after all, selves? Isn't this just to affirm precisely what the tradition denies? And that's not the case, I think, if we rightly understand exactly what it is that Buddhists are refuting when they refute selves. Nagarjuna agrees with all Buddhists in thinking the self idea is fundamentally incoherent. There is no kind of thing which is what anyone really is. But it's just that he additionally says that the same analysis applies to the explanatorily basic categories of Abhidharma. The same analysis applies to those as applies to selves. And to fail to appreciate that is to fail to be fully consistent in applying the lessons of the Buddhist tradition. So, the point of the cardinal Buddhist doctrine, the doctrine of selflessness, I am saying, Nagarjuna argues, is that nothing at all exists in the way that we are habitually committed to thinking that ourselves exist. And one way to say this is to say that being a person is just not the sort of phenomenon that could be captured by positing any kinds of objects. So whether you say that being a person really consists in being an Atman, or that it really consists in being a causally continuous series of momentary events, either way you are adducing some kind of thing or things that being a person really consists in, and that's just not a phenomenon that can be captured that way. So the real problem diagnosed by the Buddhist tradition on this reading is the problem of supposing that there is something that being a person ultimately consists in. On one account of the Buddhist tradition's guiding insights, namely Nagarjuna's account as I understand it, and here I additionally help myself to some things that later Tibetan tradition says about how to fit Nagarjuna into the larger tradition, the Buddhist project does require the self-transformative practice of internalizing Abhidharma. So in order for Nagarjuna's view to make sense as something other than just ratifying our ordinary pre-critical intuition, the risk here is that I'll be taken as saying that, well, Nagarjuna is just showing that no philosophical project works, therefore everything should just be left as it is. And the point is, no, you first have to have entertained the Abhidharma project. You first have to have shown that, you first have to have engaged in the exercise of making real, of Bhavana, the Abhidharma literature's exhaustively impersonal redescription of what there is. The point is, though, that in order for the exercise then to be complete, we must then additionally engage with Nagarjuna in the exercise of coming to understand that it doesn't make sense to think that the Abhidharma redescription captures the ultimate truth of the matter either. But only having taught ourselves with Abhidharma to see that being a person will indeed admit of alternative descriptions, can we then come to appreciate what the Buddhist tradition would really have us understand. Namely, that the problem isn't so much that we habitually suppose that what really exists is selves, as that we habitually suppose that there's anything at all it makes sense to say there really is. So, with regard, again, to the question I posed earlier, does the practice of Bhavana, does the practice of making real the Abhidharma redescription of experience, does that practice, should that practice be understood as facilitating the discovery of something true independent of the practice, or should it be understood as producing the truth? Nagarjuna would have us appreciate that there is something true to be discovered, namely that there is nothing ontologically basic, there is nothing ultimately real, but also that discovering that first requires discovering or producing the truth realized in the Abhidharma literature. So you do have to first produce this understanding, which will then be recognized as itself not ultimately true. And only by doing that can you really appreciate what is ultimately true, namely that there are no ultimately real things. Only then can we rightly understand that the self-transformative practice of realizing selflessness, the self-transformative practice of realizing that there are no selves, does not, in fact, preclude our continuing to live in a world of suffering persons who warrant our compassion.